So today I would like to sort of show an example of debugging a program in the context of the student program that we had before. So essentially we're going to be using Intelij IDEA for this particular task because the debugger in Intelij is by a far cry much more sophisticated than Eclipse, in my opinion. Of course, you could have a different opinion, but that's just what I think. So let's suppose that we have let's say we have an array here, right, of doubles, and that will essentially have a length of 2, which means we have two two boxes in memory within which we can insert data. And of course, each box has an index with which we can actually reference each element starting from 0. So that would, for the first box, it would be 0, and then for the second box, it would be 1. So actually, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to essentially display this at the top to just reference this later, that we have 2 boxes, and these are our indexes, 0 and 1. Now that we've declared our array of length 2, we are essentially going to we're going to give the user a certain option, right? And of course, in order to do that, we have to have an integer which stores their option. In the do while loop, we are going to say, okay, enter 1 to essentially populate the array, and we can say enter 2 to print the array values. Okay. So essentially, after we do this, we will essentially initialize option, and while we'll give them a third option, which will say enter 3 to exit the program. And after they do this, we can say, well, while the option does not equal to 3, keep executing this block of code again and again until option equals 3, which of course would prompt the compiler to break out of the loop, the do while, that is. So within the do while, I mean, if they choose option 3, so if their option is equal to 3, then what we want to do here is we want to essentially take our array, which is array, right? And we're going to put that in a method which is responsible to essentially populate the array. We're going to call the populate array. Now, of course, it's showing us red because we don't actually have an array which populates. So what we can do in order to fix that is we can come out of our main method, right? Because it starts from here and it sort of ends here. And we'll have other methods within our class. We'll have static methods, and we'll have 2 of them. One will populate the array, and essentially, let's see, we'll have one which will populate the array, and we'll have another method which will print out the array values. So this is going to be the populate array method. That is going to be static. It is not attached to an object by any means. It will essentially return the populated array. So we're going to put double there with our 2 brackets to symbolize that we are going to populate, we're going to be returning an array. So this is our return type. And we're going to name it populate. Now, as I mentioned before, we're actually going to take an array. It's going to register an array. And this can of course be called sum array. So I could put essentially I could put any array I want into this populate method, and it will populate that method, or it will populate that array a certain number of times, and that certain number of times would be for the array.length that it contains. The array.length in this case is, let's see, 2. So if I load array into this method here, which takes in some array, in this case it's taking my array, it will also register the length of the array. So if I essentially, if I say, okay, I want it to populate, okay, so I don't want to populate for the entire length of the array. Essentially, I want to populate I want to populate one element at a time. So it will populate the array, but one element at a time. Okay, so what this method will do is it's going to say system.out.println. It will say enter in value, or enter value, and that value will essentially just take in an amount, or let's just say a value, and it will populate the first, it'll essentially populate the first element. So when I call this method, it should just tell me to populate this particular box. And then the next time I call it, it will allow me to populate this particular box. So each and every time I call the method, it will essentially populate one element at a time. And those elements are referenced by indexes, okay, which correspond to those elements. So for what I want to do is I essentially want to just say, okay, I'm going to reference the sum array, and this is of course the general array which I could input here, and I want to populate the first index with the value that they enter in. And after that happens, I'm going to return the array, or I'm going to return sum array. Okay. However, what I wanted to do was each and every time this method is called, I want it to populate one element at a time at a particular index. So this is sort of referencing the 0th index. What we do is we preface by noting the name of the array, and then we note the index. So this is the name of the array, and the number inside the box is the index. Okay, and so each and every time this method is called, it's just going to set, it's essentially going to set, it's going to set the element at the 0th index to the value that they enter in. That's not what I want, right? So let me sort of display this here, what the problem is, and then I'll sort of elaborate on the solution. So let me go ahead and make a print method which will take in any given array, and it will essentially use a for loop to it'll essentially use a for loop to let's see, just print out those values. Okay. And so when I actually run this program here and I say, okay, if they choose option 1, I'm going to give them the option to populate, and I will also give them the choice for option 2, which can just signify that they can populate the array, or actually print the array in question. So I say, okay, I want to populate the array. and it's not letting me do this, right? It's not essentially sending me to the populate array method because I actually have to specify the correct choice in order to do that. So I want to populate the array, and I'm populating, and then I print out the values. So you can see that I chose to populate the array here, and I entered in a value, and that was 20. And then I did it again. I wanted to populate the array again because I chose 1, and I entered in the value, which was 40. So it's only, so these are essentially my elements, and it's only populating the first element because I'm referencing the 0th index at all times. So what would be more convenient here is if I had a variable for the index, right? Because you can see that's the entire problem. The index is not changing. I say, okay, change the element at index 0 to value each and every time I call this array or this method. So it's probably not. So the solution here is if I had a variable for the index, and the index kept incrementing each and every time I call the method, or before I call the method, then index will essentially accurately reflect which index I'm on. So I want to have a variable called index, and index will essentially keep track. So if I call the method once, if I call the method once, index will equal 0, because of course we need to be on the 0th index to grab the first element. But if I call the method again, index should increment by 1, such that when I load the index variable into the populate method, which would look something like this, right? Populate method, index will take me to the corresponding element at the index I specified. Okay, so what I really mean by this is, okay, think of it this way. If I had an integer called index, and that's defaulted to 0, and I load the array that I want, okay, and I say, okay, my index is, it's also going to take an index, so index is 0. What it does here is it says, okay, the populate array method is called, it takes in some array and some index. In this case, it's going to take this array, and the index is 0. So it's going to take in the array that I have here, and the index is 0. And then we call the populate array method, and it's now registered my array and my index. So it would say that this is an array, the array that I had up here, the array, it's an array of length 2. It has 0 to 1 indexes, so 2 elements. And then it asks me to enter in the value. And then I say, okay, sum array index equals value. And then I essentially return the array. And so that would essentially reflect, but of course, what I'd want to do is, if I call this method, then I want to increment index by 1, so that the next time I come here, index isn't 0, it's 1, so that it takes me to the next box, sort of the next index, which references the next element. So that then it asks me for value, and then it stores, and then index is 1, and then it stores it in there. So let's see if this is feasible here, right? So I populate the array, and I enter in a value. I populate the array again. I enter in a value, and and then I want to print out the array values. So you can see here that I've entered in two values, 20 and 50, but it's only stored the latest value that I entered, which was 50. And so it's only populating the first at all times. Why is that? It's only populating the first at all times. Well, let's use the debugger, right? So where do I populate the array? I populate the array if I choose option 1 here. And so then we're going to start from option 1. So this is called a breakpoint. And the breakpoint essentially keeps track of, or essentially it's a marker for where you'd want to start looking at your code more closely. And we can't run it in the traditional way. We can't run it like this. This is running the program. This is sort of running the debugger here. So what this does is it opens up this perspective where you can have your program here it sort of in parallel to your pane, your debug pane. And so it's saying, okay, so it's registered this code, and it's saying, because that's not where my breakpoint is. So it's registered this code and it's saying, okay, enter in one of these values. And so I enter in 1, and then it stops. It says, okay, you're at the breakpoint. This is where your program will break, and essentially it's where your program will break. And so now we're going to look at this more closely. And so it says, okay, you chose option 1, right? So now option is a variable, and it's stored here. It says option is equal to 1. That's what I chose. It was declared and initialized. And it says, okay, option is equal to 1. This Boolean expression inside this if statement parameter is true. And so it says, okay, option is equal to 1. This just shows you that option is being stored there. And so here, now, so you can either do two things, and you can do many more, but mainly you can either do two things. You can either step over or step into. Step over will just be skipping a line. Stepping into will actually lead you into the method itself, or the if statement, or method, or whatnot, or several other things. But so here we can step into, and so now we're inside the if statement. And so here it says, okay, your index is 0, right? Because that's what we had up here. And then you've loaded in an array. This is the identifier for the array, and you can see the array here. And this has, of course, length 2, because this is what I've specified. If I did 3, then this would update to 3. So the default values for the arrays, they're all 0, right? And so essentially, so now we're here. You have index. Your index is 0. That's your default, and you have an array of length 2, and of course the index. So these are the elements. The corresponding index would be 0 and 1, because the count starts with 0, and the indexes are nothing but a means by which you can actually access the element inside the array. So if we step into, again, we're actually going to be stepping into the populate method, which loads in our array, our length, our default values, and our index, which is equal to 0, because that's what we've declared at the top. So we step into the populate array method, and now we are suddenly transported to the populate array method. And again, so some array, so it's saying, okay, this is going to take in some array and an index. The index that was carried over was 0, remember, because our index up here was 0 and whatnot. So those values were carried over. Now some array is actually, so some array is just a placeholder for the array that we enter in. You can see that now some array has now a length of 2, because that's what we loaded in. We loaded in array into the populate method, and populate takes some array and then it matches that. So so this reflects what we had before with our array, and our index is 0. And so now it's asking us to enter a value. And so now we're going to step over, which is just registering line by line. And then now the computer has registered something called a value, and now it'll ask us for a value. It says the application is running, right? So here we can actually just enter in a value, and now it takes us back to where we can actually debug more. And so it says, okay, value, there's this variable called value. You entered in 50, and this is shown here. And your index is still 0, right? And you have, and your array is still empty. Your sum array, which actually represents the array you entered before, is still empty. And on this line here, on this line, what we're going to do is we're going to take some array at a particular index. Again, our index is 0,
and it's going to set it equal to the value that we entered here. So the value is 50, our index is 0. So here we have 0 and 1. These are our indexes, these are our elements. And essentially it's going to go to index 0, which is the first, and set it equal to 50, the value. That's what this line essentially illustrates. And so after we execute this, after we step over, or rather, yeah, after we step over, you can see that our first, the index at our first element, which sort of corresponds to the first element, is now set to 50, the value that we'd entered before, because that's what the line illustrates. An index is incremented, right? And then index is now equal to 1, and some array, and so now we're returning what we had here. So now the array has been updated to this value, 50 and 0, and then it returns it back to the main method. And so when we step over, we're essentially transported back to where the method was executing, and then we break out of the method. So now it's returned the array that we had. So some array was just sort of a mask for array itself. And so we step over, and then it says, okay, while option does not equal 3, again, option does not equal 3 yet, right? Keep executing the loop. And this actually shows you that it's a part of the do while. It was up there. And so we step over again, and then it says, okay, we're going to do the do while again. We're going to register these options, and then you can see them registering on the right-hand side. And then it registers option again. You can enter an option again. Again, it sort of threw out the option that we had last time because it's sort of allowing you to enter it again. So we can enter in an option, and so now it's waiting for us to enter in an option. So if we do one again, if we want to populate the array again, right, we would expect that we could now populate not the 0th index, not the element at the 0th index, but now we can populate the element, the second element at the first index. And so when we do this, when we say, okay, I want to populate the array again, it says, okay, your Boolean expression is true, your option is equal to 1. Let's go ahead and step into, again, index is 0. This is not what we wanted. What we wanted was index should be 1 because we incremented index by 1 here. And so we thought that would be relayed back to the method. And so the next time we call the populate method, instead of being index 0, index would be 1. So that instead of populating instead of populating the element at the 0th, we would populate the element at the first, and the first index, the 0th and the first index. So it seems like while we increment our index by 1 here, that is not returned. We're returning the array, we're not returning the index. So that's the root of our problem. That's why we're not able, that's why we're only sort of populating the first, that's why we're only populating the first element at the 0th index at all times, right? And so that's demonstrated here. Index is not being updated to represent what we want. And so when we print this out, it's only populating the first element. So it seems like what we should do, a good way around this, is to take index out of here completely, right? And instead, what we can do is after, because this is really referring to 2 different indexes, right? I mean, well, it's not, but that value is not relayed back to the top. So essentially what we could do is we could just increment index here, and that would essentially allow us to make that value consistent. So for the first iteration, index will be 0, right? And you would just place whatever value you'd entered into the 0th index, and then return that array. And then after this is then executing, index will increment so that when you call it again, anytime you call it again, index will be 1 or 2, or it will update the value. So now when you relay back index here, index will actually hold a value which is consistent throughout. So let's go through, let's see if this works first and foremost, right? Let's see if this works. So let's go ahead and run the program. and we populate the array. We want to populate the array again, and so we'd expect for both values to actually hold the values that we entered, unlike the first time where we were only populating the first element in the array. So this one worked, right? That's great. But you'll notice that if we do one again, we only have a length of 2. I mean, we only have these 2 boxes, right? And we don't have a third box, so it doesn't make sense to populate the second array, which is actually the third element, or the second index, which is actually the third element, because we go from 0, 1, 2, right? So now we enter in a value, and we get this exception. Index 2 out of bounds for length 2. That's a problem. That's a problem. Where does this happen? Let's go to the debugger again. Okay. We're asked to enter an option. We enter the option. It's true. We step into so we have what we had before, and then we enter in a value. We're asked to enter in a value. We do that. That value is stored in the 0th element in the array. That array is relayed back to the main method, and then as we step out, index is incremented to 1. Okay, this is part of the do while. And since option does not equal 3 yet, we do the do while again. We register these values, and then we do the whole thing again, right? So now we're going to answer. Okay, I want to populate the array again, and oops. I want to populate the array again, and we are going to, again, step into and populate, and it's going to do all that. Now that index is equal to 1, it's actually referring to the first index instead of just the 0th. And so now you can see after this line, it will execute, it will store value in the first index. Because again, we incremented index by 1 before, right? And so now we step into, and now we're back here, right? So we've stepped into, and now we're back in the main method, and we've relayed back this array, which has these values, 50 and 2. And so you can actually see this here, right? So we have an array, 50 and 12, rather. And you can see that the index is 0 for the first element, and it's 1 for the second element. And as we go, we increment index by 2. So now it's going to reference the second index, which doesn't have a possible element. There isn't even an index 2. So it's going to be array out of bounds. And so when we do this entire thing again, and we say, okay, we want to populate the array again, we're going to step into, and you can see that it's asking for us to enter in a value if we step over. And when we enter in a value, it refers to the index 2, because the index was 1 on the previous time we called this method, and now the index is 2. So it refers to 2. So you can already see it saying array out of bounds exception. And when we enter this value, we essentially we get array out of bounds. So where does this happen? Well, this happened in our populate array method, right? So the best way to go about it is to say, okay, well, if the index is essentially, if the index is, where do we increment the index? Where is the increment? Where is the index incremented each time? Well, it's incremented here. So you can only populate the array if the index is less than or equal to 1. Okay, and if it's less than or equal to 1, and I'm saying this because, again, I can only enter into, again, I'm saying this because I'll show you shortly, but so if the index is less than or equal to 1, then only then would it make sense to populate the array, because we have the length 2 array, and we have our indexes as 0 and 1. And so essentially, if the index as it increments, if it's less than or equal to 1, in other words, if it's less than 1, which could be 0, or equal to 1, which could be 1, then and only then can you populate the array and increment index by 1. Otherwise, it'll increment, and it would increment beyond 1, which would take us to the index 2, which would give us the out of bounds exception. So we'll say, okay, well, you can't do that, right? So we're going to say have reached, we're going to say maximum limit reached. And what that will do is it will essentially allow us to, we're going to print this in ERR. So it's not gonna carry through with this if the index doesn't represent the length of the array. And let's see if that's something that works. So if I can enter in a value, I can print out the value so far. I only have one value, and I can populate the array again with 250, and then I can see that okay, it's populated with 250. And I can now populate the array again. Whoa, can't do that. Maximum limit reached. So that's a good way to sort of demonstrate that, right? And let's see. So what we were doing before was sort of inefficient, right? So now this really reflects what we'd like. Now the context of this program was just to show you that we can actually populate an array and create a method to do that and whatnot. So that's how we debug. That's how we sort of populate the array with modularization, and that's about it.